Bad Blood: Secrets and Lies in a Silicon Valley Startup by John Carreyrou. Introduction. Imagine this. It's November 2006. A team of engineers at a small startup in California is celebrating. Their young, charismatic founder, a woman named Elizabeth Holmes, has just called them from Switzerland with incredible news. She had just demonstrated their revolutionary blood testing system to executives at Novartis, one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world. And according to her, the demo was perfect. Novartis was so impressed, she said, they were ready to talk about a major financial deal. For the employees of this 3-year-old startup, called Theranos, this was the moment they'd been working for. Their technology? A small box that promised to run hundreds of blood tests from a single drop of blood, was about to change the world. But downstairs, away from the celebration, the company's chief financial officer, a man named Henry Moseley, had a knot in his stomach. Something didn't feel right. The engineers who had traveled with Elizabeth to Switzerland didn't look triumphant, they looked downcast, worried. So, he started asking questions. And what he uncovered was the beginning of a secret so dark, so audacious, it would eventually unravel into one of the biggest corporate frauds in American history. The perfect demo in Switzerland? It was a complete fake. When the machine malfunctioned, the team in California had secretly beamed a pre-recorded, fake result to the screen in Switzerland, right under the noses of the Novartis executives. When Moseley confronted Elizabeth Holmes, telling her, "We've been fooling investors. We can't keep doing that," he expected a discussion. A debate. Instead, her cheerful demeanor vanished. Her eyes turned to ice. And in a chillingly deep voice, she told him, "Henry, you're not a team player. I think you should leave right now." And just like that, he was fired. This single moment captures the heart of the story we're about to explore, a story masterfully unraveled by investigative journalist John Carreyrou in his breathtaking book, Bad Blood. This isn't just a business story. It's a thriller, a cautionary tale, and a profound lesson about the line between ambition and deception. By the end of our time together, you will understand how a visionary idea, meant to save lives, became a dangerous lie that put them at risk, and how a charismatic leader built a multi-billion-dollar empire on nothing but a promise. This is the story of Theranos. Book summary. Every great story, even the dark ones, begins with a dream. And Elizabeth Holmes knew from a very young age that she was destined for greatness. When she was just 9 or 10 years old, a relative asked her what she wanted to be when she grew up. Without a moment's hesitation, she replied, "I want to be a billionaire." The relative, a bit taken aback, asked, "Wouldn't you rather be president?" Young Elizabeth's response was chillingly confident. "No, the president will marry me because I'll have $1 billion." This wasn't just a child's fantasy. It was a declaration. Her ambition was fueled by a family history steeped in stories of immense wealth and influence. Her great-great-grandfather was the founder of the Fleischmann Yeast Company, a business that had turned his family into American royalty. But later generations, as her father Chris would often tell her, had squandered that fortune. The lesson she took away was that you had to live a purposeful life. It wasn't enough to just be rich, you had to leave a mark on the world. So, when she arrived at Stanford University in 2002 as a brilliant and ambitious chemical engineering student, she was already looking for her purpose. She found it in her own fear. Elizabeth, like her mother, had a deep phobia of needles. The whole process of getting blood drawn, the big needle, the vials of blood, seemed archaic and brutal to her. What if there was a better way? Drawing on her studies and a summer internship in Singapore during the SARS epidemic, she came up with an idea that seemed to come straight from science fiction, an arm patch that could painlessly draw a tiny sample of blood, analyze it in real time, and even deliver medication. She was just 19 years old. She took the idea to one of her favorite professors, Channing Robertson. Robertson was a star at Stanford, a charismatic teacher who saw something special in Elizabeth. He was so impressed by her vision and her drive that he told her something she would never forget: she should drop out of college and pursue her dream. He would later compare her to titans like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. With his blessing, Elizabeth did just that. In 2003, she founded a company she would eventually call Theranos, a blend of the words therapy and diagnosis. The initial vision of an all-in-one patch was quickly recognized as impossible, bordering on science fiction. So, the idea was simplified. The new goal was a small, portable device, a cartridge and a reader, that could run hundreds of tests on just a tiny drop of blood from a simple finger prick. She called it the iPod of healthcare. The idea was electrifying. Imagine a world where you could monitor your health from your own home, catching diseases like cancer or diabetes at their earliest stages. It would save lives. It would change everything. This vision was so powerful that it attracted millions of dollars from some of the biggest names in Silicon Valley and beyond. She got a $1 million check from Tim Draper, a famous venture capitalist and the father of a childhood friend. Larry Ellison, the billionaire founder of Oracle, invested. The money started pouring in. But from the very beginning, there was a huge, gaping chasm between the vision Elizabeth was selling and the reality of what her engineers could build. The central problem was the physics. Elizabeth insisted the device work with a microscopic amount of blood, just a single drop. But that tiny sample had to be diluted with a saline solution just to create enough volume for the machine's internal mechanisms to work with. And when you dilute a sample that much, the signals you're trying to measure become incredibly faint, almost impossible to detect accurately. The first version of the device, known as the Theranos 1.0, was a disaster. It was unreliable, prone to leaking, and rarely produced a consistent result. It was more of a mock-up than a functioning medical device. But that didn't stop Elizabeth from demonstrating it to potential investors and partners. This is where the deception began. Henry Moseley, the CFO who was fired for questioning the fake Novartis demo, wasn't the first or last person to see the truth. Early employees knew the machine didn't work. So how did they pull off the demos? They developed a trick. They would show a video on a computer screen of a blood sample flowing through the device in real time. But for the grand finale, the result? They would simply display a pre-recorded result from one of the rare times the machine had actually worked. It was a magic trick. A complete sham, designed to convince investors that the technology was real. And it worked. By 2006, the company had burned through its initial funding and was still struggling with the basic science. The pressure was immense. An engineer named Ed Koo was hired to turn the prototype into a real product, but he quickly realized the task was impossible under Elizabeth's constraints. The insistence on a tiny drop of blood, he knew, was the fatal flaw. But whenever he suggested using a bit more blood to make the science work, she would flatly refuse. The one tiny drop was the cornerstone of her vision, the very thing that made Theranos sound so revolutionary. To abandon it would be to admit the dream was a lie. And Elizabeth Holmes would not do that. Instead, she fostered a culture of extreme secrecy and control to hide the failures. Information was compartmentalized. The chemistry team wasn't allowed to talk to the engineering team. Only Elizabeth and her mysterious, much older boyfriend, a man named Sunny Balwani, had the full picture. Employees who questioned things or raised problems were labeled as not team players and were often fired on the spot. A colleague could be there one day and gone the next, with no explanation. It created an atmosphere of intense fear and paranoia. By 2007, it was clear that the original technology, based on microfluidics, was a dead end. Instead of admitting failure, Theranos secretly pivoted. A new engineering team, led by a no-nonsense Irishman named Tony Nugent, was tasked with creating a new device. Tony knew that building a sophisticated microfluidic system from scratch was too hard. So, he took a shortcut. He ordered a commercial glue dispensing robot, a simple mechanical arm designed to squirt glue on a factory line, and repurposed it. He attached a pipette to the robotic arm and programmed it to mimic the steps a chemist would take in a lab. He put this entire contraption inside a black box. This device, which employees derisively called the Gluebot, became the new heart of Theranos' technology. Elizabeth, ever the marketer, gave it a much more inspiring name, the Edison. Here is the unbelievable truth. A company on its way to being valued at billions of dollars, promising to revolutionize medicine, was secretly running its operations on a modified glue robot. And even the Edison barely worked. At the same time, Elizabeth was becoming obsessed with another Silicon Valley icon, Steve Jobs. She began to emulate him in every way she could. She started wearing a uniform of a black turtleneck and black pants. She hired away several key employees from Apple, including a designer named Anna Oriola, to make the Edison look beautiful, even if it didn't work. The outer case was designed by a world-famous industrial designer to be sleek and minimalist, just like an Apple product. She called the Edison the iPod of healthcare. The problem was, you can't fake it till you make it with a medical device. You can't ship a blood testing machine with bugs the way you can with software. Lives are at stake. But this fundamental truth seemed to be lost on Elizabeth. The former Apple employees were horrified by the culture at Theranos. The company was run on fear and paranoia. An IT manager named Matt Bissell and his team monitored employees' computer activity, their emails, even their Facebook posts. Administrative assistants tracked what time employees arrived and left. Dinner was catered late every evening, not as a perk, but as a way to pressure people into working until 10 o'clock at night. When the company's board of directors would visit, employees were instructed not to make eye contact with them. Elizabeth would usher the board members into a glass conference room and pull down the shades, as if they were CIA agents conducting a secret briefing. One of the new Apple hires was Avi Tevanian, a legendary software engineer who had been one of Steve Jobs' closest friends and a key leader at Apple. He joined the Theranos board, excited by Elizabeth's vision. But he soon grew suspicious. Elizabeth would present rosy revenue projections based on deals with pharmaceutical companies, but the money never seemed to materialize. When he asked to see the contracts, he was told they were under legal review. The product rollout was endlessly delayed, with a new technical excuse every quarter. He realized the company was a mess. When he started asking tough questions in board meetings, Elizabeth decided he had to go. The chairman of the board, Don Lucas, who doted on Elizabeth like a granddaughter, asked Avi to resign. He was pushed out for doing his job. A few months later, in the spring of 2008, two senior executives, Todd Surtee, the head of sales, and Michael Esquivel, the general counsel, discovered the same thing Avi had. The revenue projections Elizabeth was showing the board were pure fantasy. They knew the technology was nowhere near ready, so there was no way the company could be making that kind of money. They went to the board and told them the truth. This time, the board acted. They held an emergency meeting and made a decision. They would remove Elizabeth Holmes as CEO. She was too young, too inexperienced, and she was misleading them. She was called into the room to be informed of her termination. This should have been the end of the story. But then, something extraordinary happened. Over the next 2 hours, Elizabeth, with her back against the wall, gave the performance of her life. She was contrite. She was charming. She admitted she had made mistakes and promised to be more transparent. She convinced them to give her another chance. And they did. The board reversed its decision. She had survived a coup. Her first act after walking out of that room? She fired both of the executives who had exposed her. The message to everyone at Theranos was clear. Loyalty to Elizabeth was more important than the truth. Anyone who crossed her would be destroyed. As the years went by, the deception deepened. Elizabeth knew the Edison machine could only perform a limited type of blood test, called immunoassays. But she needed to offer a full menu of tests to launch in stores. So, she and Sunny Balwani came up with a new plan. They bought standard, commercial blood analyzers made by other companies, like Siemens. Then, they secretly modified them. These machines were designed to work with normal vials of blood drawn from the arm. To make them work with the tiny fingerstick samples, Theranos engineers had to dilute the blood so much that the results became wildly unreliable. They were literally hacking other companies' machines and using them in ways that were never approved by regulators, all while pretending the results were coming from their own revolutionary technology. The company's clinical lab was divided into two parts. The main lab, with the conventional Siemens machines, was nicknamed Jurassic Park. The other room, where the faulty Edison devices were kept, was called Normandy, a reference to the D-Day landings, as if it were the beachhead for their assault on the lab industry. But the real secret was that most of the tests were being run in Jurassic Park, on the hacked Siemens machines. And the results were a mess. This is where the story turns from corporate misconduct to a genuine public health danger. By 2013, Theranos was preparing for a massive public launch. They had somehow managed to sign huge partnership deals with two of the biggest retailers in America, Walgreens and Safeway. The CEO of Safeway, Steve Bird, was completely captivated by Elizabeth. He was so convinced that Theranos would transform his grocery chain that he invested over $350 million to build sleek wellness centers inside more than half of his stores. But the launch was delayed again and again. Elizabeth would offer excuses, one time even blaming an earthquake in Japan, and Bird would accept them. He was in her thrall. Walgreens was just as eager. Executives there suffered from a severe case of fear of missing out. They were so worried their rival, CVS, would get a deal with Theranos that they ignored all the red flags. A lab consultant they hired, Kevin Hunter, was deeply suspicious from the start. On a visit to Theranos headquarters, he was treated with extreme paranoia. He wasn't allowed to see the lab and had to be escorted to the bathroom. He begged his Walgreens colleagues to demand proof that the technology worked, but they were too blinded by the hype. In September 2013, Theranos finally went live. The first wellness center opened in a Walgreens in Palo Alto. A glowing article was published in the Wall Street Journal's opinion section, engineered by one of Elizabeth's most powerful board members, former Secretary of State George Shultz. The article hailed her as the next Steve Jobs. With the launch, a new fundraising campaign began. The valuation of the company exploded. From millions, it grew to billions. Theranos became a unicorn, one of Silicon Valley's rare, billion-dollar private startups. By early 2014, it was valued at an astounding $9 billion. Elizabeth Holmes, who owned more than half the company, became the world's youngest self-made female billionaire. She was on the cover of Forbes and Fortune. She was a global celebrity, speaking at conferences, meeting with world leaders, and telling her inspiring story over and over again. But inside the company, a few brave employees were beginning to realize they couldn't live with the lies anymore. One of them was Tyler Shultz. Tyler was George Shultz's grandson. He had started working at Theranos fresh out of Stanford, inspired by Elizabeth's vision and proud to be part of a company his grandfather so strongly believed in. He was assigned to the team responsible for validating the Edison tests. And he was horrified by what he saw. The data was being manipulated. To get a test to pass its quality control checks, scientists would repeat the experiment over and over, throwing out the bad results until they got the numbers they wanted. It was the opposite of good science. They were cherry-picking data to make the devices seem accurate when they weren't. One test, for detecting syphilis, was only correctly identifying positive samples 65% of the time. But in its official report, Theranos claimed the test had a sensitivity of 95%. Tyler knew this was wrong. More than wrong, it was dangerous. At the same time, another young employee named Erica Chung was seeing the same problems. She worked in the clinical lab, processing actual patient samples. She saw the Edison machines constantly failing their quality control checks. One day, a senior employee simply deleted the failing data points and sent out a patient result anyway. Erica was shaken to her core. The most damning practice was something called proficiency testing. All clinical labs are required by law to participate in this. An outside agency sends the lab a sample with a known value, and the lab has to test it and get the right answer. It's like a final exam to prove your tests are accurate. But Theranos was cheating. For the tests it ran on the Edison devices, it knew the machines would fail. So instead, they would secretly test the proficiency samples on their conventional Siemens machines and report those results, pretending they had come from the Edisons. It was a clear violation of federal law. Tyler couldn't stay silent. He went to Elizabeth and laid out his concerns in a detailed email. The response didn't come from Elizabeth. It came from Sunny Balwani. And it was brutal. Sunny tore into Tyler, belittling his intelligence, questioning his competence, and accusing him of being ignorant. The email ended with a demand for an apology. Tyler knew then he had to quit. But he also felt a responsibility to tell his grandfather, George Schultz, who sat on the company's board. He tried to explain the scientific fraud, the data manipulation, the proficiency testing cheating. But his grandfather didn't believe him. He chose to believe Elizabeth. The situation escalated dramatically. Elizabeth called George and told him that Tyler was threatening a vendetta against her and that if he continued, he would lose. She was threatening a 23-year-old kid through his own grandfather. That night, Tyler's grandfather lured him to his house for what he thought would be a private conversation. But it was an ambush. Two of Theranos' lawyers from the powerful law firm of Boyes, Schiller and Flexner were hiding upstairs. They came down and tried to force Tyler to sign an affidavit admitting he had leaked trade secrets and naming other employees who had spoken out. For months, they harassed him. They hired private investigators to follow him. They threatened to sue his family and bankrupt them. The legal fees mounted to over $400,000. Through it all, his grandfather continued to side with Elizabeth. It was a heartbreaking betrayal. But Tyler never broke. He refused to be silenced. This is where John Carreyrou, the author of Bad Blood and a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, enters the story. He received a tip in early 2015 from a pathology blogger who had his own doubts about Theranos. The blogger put him in touch with a small circle of skeptics, which included the family of Richard Fuiss, a former neighbor Elizabeth had sued, and Rochelle Gibbons, the widow of Ian Gibbons. Ian had been one of Theranos' first and most brilliant scientists. But he grew deeply troubled by the company's scientific fraud. He knew the technology didn't work. After Elizabeth found out he might be subpoenaed to testify in the Fuiss lawsuit, the pressure became too much. He took his own life. The day after his suicide, his widow Rochelle received a call not from Elizabeth offering condolences, but from a Theranos lawyer demanding she immediately return all of Ian's confidential company property. These initial tips were alarming, but Carreyrou knew he needed more. He needed an inside source. He eventually found one in Alan Beam, the lab director who had recently quit in disgust. Alan, speaking anonymously, laid out the entire fraud: the faulty Edisons, the hacked Siemens machines, the diluted samples, the cheating on proficiency tests. Then, Carreyrou found Tyler and Erica. With their courageous testimony and the documents they had smuggled out, he had the proof he needed. Theranos, led by its famously aggressive lawyer David Boies, launched an all-out war to kill the story. They threatened to sue the Wall Street Journal. They continued to surveil and intimidate sources. Holmes even appealed directly to Rupert Murdoch, the owner of the journal's parent company, who, in a stunning revelation, had personally invested $125 million in Theranos. But Murdoch, to his credit, refused to intervene. On October 15, 2015, the Wall Street Journal published Carreyrou's first article. The headline was simple: "A Prized Startup's Struggles." The story was a bombshell. Holmes immediately went on the offensive. On national television, she called the story a lie, an attack by disgruntled former employees and entrenched competitors. She declared, "This is what happens when you work to change things. First they think you're crazy, then they fight you, and then all of a sudden you change the world." At an all-hands meeting at the company, employees were led by Sunny Balwani in a chant, "Fuck you, Carreyrou. Fuck you, Carreyrou." But the lies were beginning to unravel. Days after the first story, Carreyrou reported that the FDA had conducted a surprise inspection and forced Theranos to stop using its nanotainer and its fingerstick tests for all but one of its assays. The technology was finally being shut down. Then came the final blow. Federal regulators from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or CMS, launched their own inspection, prompted by an anonymous complaint from Erica Chung. Their findings were devastating. They found that the Newark lab posed immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety. They found that the Edison devices failed quality control up to 87% of the time for some tests. The company was forced to void or correct nearly 1 million test results. The empire crumbled. Walgreens terminated its partnership and sued for $140 million. The SEC charged Holmes and Balwani with an elaborate, years-long fraud. Holmes was forced to give up control of her company, pay a hefty fine, and was banned from being an officer of a public company for 10 years. Sunny Balwani was fired. And both of them now face a federal criminal investigation that could lead to prison time. The Empress, as it turned out, had no clothes. Commentary. The story of Theranos is so much more than just a business failure. It's a profound human drama that holds up a mirror to some of the most powerful forces in our culture: our obsession with charismatic visionaries, the intoxicating allure of Silicon Valley's change the world narrative, and the dangerous temptations of unchecked ambition. When you boil it all down, what's the most powerful lesson here? For me, it's this: a noble mission does not justify unethical means. Elizabeth Holmes told a story that we all wanted to believe. A story about empowering patients, about saving lives, about making healthcare accessible to everyone. It was a beautiful story. And perhaps, in the beginning, she even believed it herself. But when reality didn't cooperate, when the science proved too difficult, she faced a choice. She could have admitted the challenges, pivoted honestly, and taken the slow, difficult path of real innovation. Or, she could preserve the story at all costs. She chose the story. And in doing so, she began a journey of deception that led her to lie to investors, to partners, to the public, and most unforgivably, to patients. This story serves as a vital reminder that in the world of health, unlike in the world of software apps, the mantra "fake it till you make it" is not just irresponsible, it's potentially deadly. The stakes are real people's lives. The results of a blood test aren't just data points, they are pieces of information that doctors use to make life-altering decisions. So, what can we take away from this, to apply in our own lives? I see 3 simple but powerful actions. First, learn to question the story. We are surrounded by charismatic leaders and exciting new ideas. It's easy to get swept up in the hype. But it's crucial to cultivate a healthy skepticism. When something sounds too good to be true, ask the hard questions. Where's the proof? Where's the data? Don't let a compelling narrative blind you to the need for evidence. Second, understand that true innovation is almost always a slow, grinding, and collaborative process. It's rarely the product of a lone genius who has a sudden flash of insight. It's built on years of hard work, failures, and the collective effort of a team. The myth of the solitary visionary is a powerful one, but it's often just that, a myth. Real breakthroughs are built on a foundation of integrity, not on a house of cards. And finally, recognize the incredible courage of the whistleblower. This entire fraudulent empire was brought down by a handful of ordinary people who were put in an extraordinary position. People like Tyler Schultz, Erica Cheung, and Alan Beam. They were young, they were scared, and they had everything to lose. Theranos tried to crush them with legal threats and intimidation. But they spoke up anyway, because they knew it was the right thing to do. Their story teaches us that your voice matters, and that sometimes, the most heroic act is simply to tell the truth, no matter the consequences. That was the story of Bad Blood by John Carreyrou. We've explored the breathtaking rise and catastrophic fall of Theranos today, but I'll be completely honest with you, a summary, no matter how detailed, can only scratch the surface. The real power of this story lies in the details, in the human moments, and in the relentless, page-turning narrative that John Carreyrou has crafted. This summary is your map, but the book is the journey itself. If you were captivated by the drama, the intrigue, and the profound lessons we've discussed, I encourage you to pick up a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning the facts of a business scandal. It's about experiencing a thriller that will change the way you think about ambition, integrity, and the stories we choose to believe. You can find a link to the book in the description below. Also, if you found this journey valuable and want to continue exploring the books that shape the minds of the world's most successful and interesting people, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and give this summary a like. It helps us grow and ensures you won't miss our next deep dive into another life-changing book. Let's keep learning and growing together.